Hello, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be able to learn with you today. Hanukkah is often spoken about as being a festival which is important for women, a special women's chag. We know, for example, the Gemara in Shabbos famously speaks about how women have a chiyuv, despite the fact that candle lighting is a positive time-bound commandment, a mitzvahs aseh shazman grama, which we generally say women have an exemption from such mitzvahs. In this case, we say that women have an obligation to light Chanukah candles because of this principle, afhein hayubo tohanes, which we're going to loosely translate for now as because they were a central part of the Chanukah miracle. Now, the parameters of this principle, the parameters both in halacha, meaning is the principle of afhein hayubo tohaneh something which is bound to rabbinic law only, like candle lighting, or does it also extend beyond that into Torah law? As well as the philosophical dimensions of afhein hayubo tohaneh. What does it mean that they were part of the miracle? That maybe we'll leave for another time or for later. But for now, it's sufficient to say that Chanukah is fundamentally part and parcel with Chanukah is women. We see this not just in that principle, as we see it plays out in the Shulchan Aruch in source number 2 as well, afhein hayubo tohanes. But the Shulchan Aruch also speaks about how during the days of Chanukah, there is a minhag. There is a minhag, the Shulchan Aruch quotes, based in the Kolbo, for women not to do melacha while the candles are lit. And the question we need to ask ourselves is why? What is the special relationship between women and Chanukah? You see, from the outset, we can say that the history of women in Chanukah lies not just at the essence of Chanukah, but the essence of womanhood and the Jewish view of women. And more than that, it also specifically in the context of Geula. Geula, something that's really on all of our minds lately, something we're all longing for and thinking about. In general, I like to see our Jewish education as a beautiful tapestry. It's a tapestry of stories, of anecdotes, of halacha, of all the different pieces. And the tapestry of our Jewish education is kind of woven together with many threads of different pieces of literature and information from different eras, different times in our own lives, and different eras and perspectives of decades gone. And this, in a sense, gives us a rich, diverse narrative of Jewish understanding in our lives, and we experience that every time we revisit a Chag year after year. But since our Jewish education is made up of so many different pieces, I think it's appropriate for both those who are intellectually honest and also those who are simply spiritually seeking to ask ourselves, where does everything come from? Have you ever had that experience where you're learning something in Judaism and you say, oh, that's a pasuk from Nevi'im? Or maybe you learn something and then you say, oh, wow, I didn't realize that was a medrash, or that comes from here, or that comes from there. So sometimes it's helpful to kind of take a step back and ask ourselves, where does this information come from? Where do these threads of my Jewish tapestry, where is the original source? And through that, I can come up to a deeper understanding of what they mean. Now, let's try to do the same with women in Chanukah, because we know certain stories about women, Chanukah, Yehudis maybe, this woman, Chana, Miriam. We know different pieces, but it's helpful, I think, for the sake of honesty and the sake of meaning, to understand where these stories come from, what their origin is, and then what that impacts, how that impacts the way that we see them. And let's begin, I think, by placing Chanukah in the Jewish history context in general. We know that the Chanukah story takes place after the end of the canonization of Tanakh. Tanakh closes really shortly after the Purim story, and that happens around 350 years before Chanukah. So it's not surprising, obviously, that we don't find a hint to Chanukah. We don't find Chanukah, the story of Chanukah, in the Tanakh, because the Tanakh is no longer being written when the Hanukkah story takes place. That being said, we see many references to Hanukkah, whether it's almost explicit references, like in the books of Haggai and Daniel, or we see hints to Hanukkah, which the Hasidic sources are very good at speaking out and understanding deeply throughout the Chamisha Chumshei Torah and other places. But the Hanukkah story itself and the details of that story don't appear anywhere in Tanakh. Let's fast forward to what happens shortly after the Hanukkah story. Around 150, 200 years after the Hanukkah story is the time of the Tanaim, the time of the rabbis of the Mishnah, and later on the writing of the Mishnah, and then the Gemara. In other words, Hanukkah's almost sandwiched between the written law and the oral law. Not only that, but excuse me, during the writing of the written law, during the writing of the Mishnah and the Gemara, you would think that that Hanukkah plays a very central role, being that Hanukkah is recent history. In other words, if Hanukkah happened 150 years, 200 years before the writing down of the Mishnah and the Gemara, then surely the Mishnah and the Gemara are going to speak out this very relevant story that just occurred to the Jewish people, and yet that's not the case. The story of Hanukkah, of the oil lasting for 8 days, of the war, that's mentioned in 3 tiny little lines in the Gemara in Shabbos, and it's not mentioned at all in the Mishnah. The Mishnah speaks about the halachas of lighting candles, but nothing about the story. And the reason why the actual story and details of Hanukkah don't appear in the Torah Shebaal Peh is for a different time, because today we're going to talk about women. So where do we get the bulk of the story of Hanukkah? For example, the stories about the people spinning dreidels and the bows and arrows and all the details that, again, we grew up with in our Jewish tapestries. Where does that come from? There are 2 primary sources to the Hanukkah story. The one is Josephus, who was a Jewish historian, even though he didn't maybe identify as such, details much of the Hanukkah stories in his writings. And there is another book called Sefer HaMakkabim. Sefer HaMakkabim forms part of a big corpus of text, which is known as the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha is a whole bunch of books that was written around the 2nd century BCE, so around the time of the Hanukkah story, and they aren't included in Tanakh, and at the same time, these books are not included in Torah Shebaal Peh, and they're kind of somewhere in between. Their religious status is hotly debated throughout the generations. There are different views, and in different communities, really, there's different views to them. But essentially, in a broad brushstroke kind of summary of it all, we can say that largely we see the Apocrypha as something which has important historical value. It gives us details in terms of the information contained within, even though the religious importance maybe is somewhat debated, and there are elements of the Apocrypha that aren't accurate. It's by and large seen as something which has important historical information. And Sefer HaMakkabim, the parts that form at least part of the uncontested Jewish Apocrypha, there's 2 parts to the Sefer HaMakkabim that we hold as part of our Apocrypha, Makkabim 1 and Makkabim 2. And it's written by somebody who lived probably around the time of the Hanukkah story. In fact, he probably lived through it and was writing it down. Maybe he was part of the Maccabee army or something, and he writes down the story. The original Sefer HaMakkabim, which was written in Hebrew, is lost, and we don't have the original Hebrew, but we have some translation. So again, not just the original accuracy is in question, but there are details within our text that give us questions. There's another book which contains much of the information about the Hanukkah story called Megillas Antiochus, which was written much later on. It was translated late, even after that, by Rav Sadia Gaon. But much of the stories from Megillas Antiochus are actually taken from Sefer HaMakkabim. So Sefer HaMakkabim is really the text. If you wanted to study and learn about the original stories of Hanukkah in their most original form, you would go to Sefer HaMakkabim. Now here's the thing. The story of Yehudis. Remember the story of Yehudis, the woman who goes to Helifornos and she feeds him cheese and wine and cuts off his head and puts his head on the spear or sword and walks through the town and defeats the enemy. This amazing story which is seen as something so primary, in the Chanukah experience, in the Chanukah story, actually doesn't appear anywhere in Sefer HaMaccabim, which is incredibly surprising. There is no appearance of the miracle of Yehudis, the heroine of Yehudis, this daughter of the Kohen Gadol. That does not appear in Sefer HaMaccabim. So where do we get it from? The truth is, there is another book of Apocrypha. There is another book called Sefer Yehudis. And Sefer Yehudis, and it's important to understand this, has nothing to do with Chanukah. It's not a Chanukah story. It's a story about a Jewish hero, a Jewish woman whose husband dies, and the story is kind of set during a time of a king called Nebuchadnezzar. Now, we know from our Tanakh that Nebuchadnezzar was in control and destroyed the first Beis Hamikdash. But this is talking about a different Nebuchadnezzar, maybe, who lived during the time of the second Beis Hamikdash. And this woman, Yehudis, her husband dies, and she goes into mourning, and she wears black clothes for 3 years. And at the time, there's somebody who's a nation, a foreign nation, also unclear exactly who that nation is. And that nation is oppressing the Jews tremendously in that time. And she decides to do something about it. And she gets dressed beautifully, and she goes out to Helifornos, who is the leader of the time. And let's take a look at just a tiny excerpt that I brought from Sefer Yehudis to see what happens. Source number 4 over here, Sefer Yehudis tells you, Vayehi Kietzu Kulam. She comes into the room and she says to Helifornos, I want to have an audience alone with you. And they kick everybody else out. Which, as we read Sefer Yehudis, I hope that for those of you who are more familiar with Nach, you have certain parts of, or specifically Nevi'im, you have certain parts of the story which are going to like ring a lot of bells for you, and we'll talk about why. So she comes into the room, she says, Helifornos, I need a private audience, please take all your soldiers and everybody else out the room. And they all leave the room. Velonish ar ish ba'ohel. And nobody else is left in the tent. Lemi katan va'ad gadol, from small to big. V'tigash el hamita asher hu shachev aleha. And she approaches the bed that Helifornos is lying on. And v'titpalel beliba, and she prays in her heart, and she says, El Elokim, please, Hashem, asher b'yadcha hakoach v'hagvura, that you have the strength, you have the might. Habeit na ura'eh, please look at Maseh yadai, yedei shivchatecha, laharim keren Yerushalayim, please look at what I'm about to do, help me. Hine karva et pedut am nachalatecha, behold, the time has come now to redeem your people. And he said, she davens, and she says, Hashem, help me. Latek nakama bagoyim, to avenge, take revenge amongst the nations, asher kamu alenu, who've come before you. And she approaches the amud, the pillar, asher barosh hamita, which is at the front of the bed. V'tikachet cherev Helifornos, and she takes out, and yes, she takes out the sword of Helifornos from him. V'tishlach et yada v'tikachehu, and she takes her sword, and she takes it and she grabs onto the tzitzit rosho, the locks of his head, and she says, and again, here's another Nach reference, Chazkeni na va'atzmeni na achapam, give me strength this time, Hashem, make me strong, make me brave this time. And she strongly chops off the head of this wicked man, and his body falls onto the bed, and she takes a pole from the bed, and she goes out with Helifornos' head. Okay, so very story which maybe details we're familiar with. As I said, not just in the context of the story of Yehudis, but we know other people like this. And we're going to talk about these cross-references in a couple minutes. But the story continues. She goes out, she manages to save the Jewish people. And then the entire end of Sefer Yehudis, this unique and somewhat mysterious book of Apocrypha, ends with a song that she sings. Vatashar Yehudis sings the song, and in the end of the song, she praises Hashem, and she thanks Hashem for saving the Jewish people. Now, the question we need to ask, there's lots of questions we need to ask ourselves. The first one is, who is Yehudis? maybe even more than that, we need to ask ourselves, was there ever really a Yehudis? Did the story actually take place? And it seems, according to many opinions, the predominant opinion actually is that there was no Yehudis. Yehudis is a story that never took place, which is fascinating. Because then the question begs, well, why did somebody write a story about a woman that never was? And more pressingly for our time and our topic, when did this become a story about Hanukkah? Here is a woman who bravely destroys some mythical woman who destroys some mythical enemy in a very defiant and brave kind of way. And at a certain point, someone felt like the story needed to be written down despite it potentially not happening. And somewhere along the way, someone felt like it was a Hanukkah story. And I think that if we can answer these questions, we can go back again to that Jewish tapestry of our education and understand what actually is the meaning of women in Hanukkah. The earliest source we actually have that attributes this story, the story of Yehudis, to the Hanukkah story is an early Rishon, a 13th century Rishon called the Kolba. And he, seemingly out of nowhere, maps out the story of Yehudis onto the Hanukkah story. Let's take a look. If you look at the Kolba in source number 5, the Kolba says, Nashim chayavot b'ner Chanukah she'af hein hayu b'oto hanes, which is a principle we began with. It's the principle that's born in the Gemara, this idea of women being part of the miracle. Now, what does it mean? Af hein hayu b'oto hanes. There seems to be a struggle within Rashi. If you look in source number 7-8, two different opinions in Rashi about what af hein hayu b'oto hanes means. In the Gemara in Shabbos, Rashi understands it to be shegazru yevanim al kol betulot hanasuot lihiba'el letefsar tchila, that all these women who were about to get married had to sleep with the officer, the Greek officer first. And he vaguely mentions that through a woman, not unclear what woman, this miracle takes place. In other words, it seems from Rashi that the primary reason, at least the first Rashi in source number 7, the primary reason why women are obligated in the candles of Hanukkah, despite it being a positive time-bound commandment, is because they were under specific threat. They were the people who the Greeks decreed that the women had to sleep with the officers first. This is a uniquely challenging situation for the women. And therefore, in response, the celebration will be uniquely or specially female. The Gemara in Psachim seems to take a slightly different angle. Or Rashi in Psachim seems to take a slightly different angle. Look what he says. He says, B'schar nashim tzidkanios sheba'oto hador nig'alu. It was in the merit of righteous women of that generation that they were redeemed. Because of the women of that generation, that's why they were redeemed, right? And he says so too with Megillah, Mikra Megillah. We read the Megillah on Purim because women are obligated, because af hein hayu b'oto hanes, meaning that this Purim story happened at the hands of Esther, and therefore they were redeemed. So he says so too ner Chanukah. And again, he doesn't mention a name of a specific person because there wasn't a specific story, it would seem, or there wasn't a specific woman in whose memory or in whose merit we got redeemed. But these are the two takes of Af hein hayu b'oto hanes. Tosfos in source number 9 grapples with these two readings. They first bring the opinion of the Rashbam, one of the Baalei Tosfot, who suggests that what Af hein hayu b'oto hanes means that, exactly like the reading of Rashi and Psachim, that the miracle happened through a woman, okay? And here he mentions, for the first time, he mentions Yehudis. But he gets it, I think, from the Kolba, which we'll take a look at in a second. But then Tosfot brings a different opinion. He said, no, Af seems to imply also, as in addition, Shehein Tfeilut, that they are secondary to the primary miracle. And therefore, he said that Af hein hayu b'oto hanes means Af hein hayu b'oto safek. They were under the same threat. They too were at threat of annihilation, just like the men were, and therefore they're obligated to celebrate. So over there, the Rashba mentions this for the first time, this name Yehudis. And we know Yehudis from the Apocrypha in a totally unrelated story, but the Kobo speaks out this relationship between Yehudis and Chanukah in a very, very explicit way and very unusual. Let's take a look. In source number 5, it says as follows: V'nashim chayavot b'ner Chanukah. Women are obligated to light Chanukah candles. Sha'af hen hayu b'toanes. Perush, here he says, Sha'oivim ba'u la'abed hakol anashim v'nashim v'taf. Just like we saw the second reading of Tosfos, just like we saw the second reading of Rashi, the enemies came to destroy women as much as they wanted to destroy men. However, he says, "V'yesh mefarshim she'al yedei isha ira lahem hanes hagadol." The entire miracle happened at the hands of a woman. Why? Ushma Yehudit. Her name was Yehudit, just like it's brought in the story. Bat hayata leYochanan Kohen Gadol. There was a daughter to Yochanan Kohen Gadol, and this but doesn't appear in the Apocrypha, that relationship. And she was Yefat Toar Ma'od. V'amar hamelech Yavan shetishkav imo. And she feeds him gvina, cheese, kadesha yitzama, that he should become very thirsty. And he drinks a lot because he's so thirsty. V'yishtaker, he becomes drunk. V'yishkav, and he falls asleep. V'yirdam. V'hi laken v'yishkav v'yirdam. So that's what happens. She feeds him cheese. She feeds him a lot, drinks him a lot, feeds him a lot of wine. He gets drunk. He falls asleep. V'tikach harbo. She takes his sword, just like we saw in Sefer Yehudis, and she cuts off his head, and she brings it to Yerushalayim. Ukiros hachayil, and when the officers see kimet giburam, that their sergeant, their head of their army, has died, vayanusu, they fled. Va'alkein, and here's the fascinating thing. The Kobo continues, and he says, okay, women are obligated in the miracle because, as the Gemara says, Af hen hayu b'toanes. How does he understand Af hen hayu b'toanes? He maps the story of Yehudis from Sefer Yehudis onto the Chanukah story. And he says, this woman was the daughter of Yochanan Kohen Gadol. This woman was the person who fought against and ultimately brought about the defeat of the Yevani army. And then he says, "Va'al kain." Therefore, and we have a custom to eat cheese products on Chanukah to remember Yehudis from the Chanukah story. Now, this is even more fascinating. In other words, we're coming up to halachic conclusions which don't appear in the Gemara, like Afen hayu b'toanes. Customs like women not doing malacha while the candles are lit, or people specifically eating cheese products, which the Rama brings later on in that Seif in the Shulchan Aruch, to specifically not eat dairy products to commemorate this miracle which happened at the hands of Yehudis. And once again, we're confronted with the question, well, why? Who was Yehudis? And why are we referring to her as the Chanukah heroine when her original story doesn't appear at all in the context of Chanukah? Let's backtrack for a couple minutes and ask ourselves, well, where does her story appear? Because if we say that the story of Yehudis never happened, then where do these facts come from? And for those of you, as I said, who are familiar with Nach, there are many parts of the Yehudis story which we can connect to people in Nach. And the most obvious, I think, is the story of Yael. The story of Yael, if we look in Shoftim, we know that Devorah, the prophetess, was a leader of the Jewish people, and Barak, who was the officer, perhaps was or wasn't her husband, who was the officer at the time, is afraid to go out to war without Devorah coming with. And Devorah says, I'll come out with you to war, but the success of this war will fall into the hands of a woman. And we know that that woman is ultimately not Devorah, it's a woman named Yael. Because Sisera, in this battle, is running away from the battlefront, and he comes and he finds this woman Yael who's sitting in her tent, and he says to her, Hashkeni na ma'at mayim, can you give me a little bit of water? Kitzamati, because I'm thirsty. And what does she give him? Vatiftach es na'od hachalav, she gives him milk. That's our first reference. Vatishkehu, and she gives him a lot to drink. Vatichasehu, and she covers him. Vayomer, and he says to her, Amod petach ha'ohel, go stand at the tent and check that someone's coming. Im ish yavo, if someone comes and asks you, Va'omar hayesh po ish, ask if there's someone there. Va'amart ayin, say no. There's two opinions of what he wants her to do here. Either he wants her to technically be on the lookout and deny the fact that there's someone inside there, or he wants, if they ask, is someone in there, meaning, is it appropriate for us to come in and search your tent? Or are you a woman who's alone, and therefore it would be improper for us to violate either the laws of Yichud or just the way of the land, that we shouldn't walk into a woman's tent if she's alone. Say you're alone so they won't come search for me. Either way, what does she do? She goes outside in the pretense of watching over and making sure that nobody comes. And she goes, Yael Eshet Chaver, and she takes the Yated HaOhel, she takes the tent peg, and she takes a hammer, Vatavoilav, and she comes forward to him quietly, Vetitka et Hayated Barakato, and she hammers the tent peg into his temple, and he falls on the ground, and he dies. And we know that maybe this is the first real overt reference here. In other words, we're seeing a very clear relationship between the story of Yehudis, the potentially theoretical, imagined story of Yehudis. Whoever's writing that story is clearly mapping a retelling of the story of Yael, a brave woman who, alone with a man, takes a unconventional weapon, takes his weapon, certainly doesn't take her own weapon, and she murders that wicked man, bringing success to the Jewish people. The other parallel is what happens later on. If the entire end of Sefer Yehudis is the song of praise that Yehudis sings, thanking Hashem for defeating the Jewish people, similarly, the story of Devorah ends. The next parak is a song, Shirat Devorah, which she praises Hashem for allowing the Jewish people to defeat their enemy, and she praises Yael within her praise of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There are two other Nach references in the story. The one is the words that Yehudis says. If we look at her words, where she asks Hashem just before she manages to destroy Helifornos, she asks Hashem, let's find it, Chazkenina va'amtsenina, Hashem achapa'am, make me stronger, give me strength this one last time. That seems to be a pretty good parallel to Shimshon. Just before, in Shimshon, in his moment of weakness, when his eyes have been gouged out, his hair has been cut, and he's surrounded by the Plishtim, and also he similarly says, Chazkenina, give me one more strength, achapa'am hazeh. And then he also asks for Nakama, v'hinakma b'pam achas ma'plishtim, and he destroys the hall of the Plishtim. Another similarity that we find here is another story from Nach, also actually another, specifically a story from Shoftim, is the story of Ehud. Ehud, who at the beginning of the book of the Shoftim, when he goes to destroy his enemy, he also over there asks for all the people to leave the room, and everybody else leaves the room, and he's left alone, and he manages to destroy his enemy. So we see here that there seems to be a couple things going on. If we started out and asked ourselves, where do we see the primary sources that connect women in the Hanukkah story, we seem to have two different things happening. On the one hand, we have this Afhein Hayubo Tohanes principle, which is intention. On the one hand, it means that they are under the same threat and therefore have the same level of obligation to celebrate the end of that threat. And on the other hand, we have they were the key center, primary reason why the Geula came in the first place. And then we have separately the story of Yehudis. Yehudis, this brave warrior lady who manages to defeat Helifornos. And somehow through the generations, not only does that get understood to be a story about Hanukkah, it also gets to be a story that has important halachic ramifications, minhagim that develop over time in order to kind of correlate to that. What's happening here? What's going on here? In between the threads of Jewish life, every generation, what's going on? And I think this is what's happening. I think that from the time of the Apocrypha, from the time of 200 onwards, in every single generation, we have the writers of Jewish history, we have the tellers of the Jewish story, who turn around and tell stories of salvation. And one after the other, generation after generation, they ask themselves, could it be that we talk about salvation that we talk about Geula, redemption from enemies, and we don't mention women, it's absolutely impossible. We cannot possibly fathom that the Jewish people are redeemed without mentioning the female heroes of that story. And so I don't think Yehudis is an imaginary person that somebody made up. I think she's much, much more primal than that. I think that Yehudis is the archetypal Jewish female heroine. What's her name? Is her name maybe Miriam? Maybe she's holding a tambourine. Maybe she's holding a drum. Maybe she has a mirror that she's looking into to see a vision of what the Jewish people could be. Or maybe her name is Devorah, and she's courageously going out to battle. Or Yael, and she's within her tent saving the Jewish people. Maybe her name is Rachav, Avigail, Bathsheba, or maybe her name is Sarah Shnira, another Jewish hero woman who refused to give in, who refused to allow the story of the Jewish people to continue as the status quo that it is, and insisted that we make a change. Maybe it's not with a tent peg or a sword. Maybe it's with a book and a vision, but certainly generation after generation, Jewish story after Jewish story, we have the heroes of that story who insist with unwavering faith, with an absolute vision of certainty of what the Jewish people could be and the state that they have to live up to. They insist on becoming the Jewish miracle. And it's so telling that this woman, this perhaps made up woman, right, whose story becomes the key to understanding and unlocking women in Hanukkah, her name is Yehudis. Yehudis means Jew. She is the Jewess. She's Yehudis the Jew, the Jewish woman who with unwavering faith, who with unsophisticated, uncomplicated, and unquestioning ability to see what needs to be, manages to save an entire Jewish people. And here we are again in another chapter of Jewish history, in another galus, in another threat. And certainly we can say, for the first time maybe since the Holocaust, af hein hayu b'oto hasafek. Just like Tosfot reads the Hanukkah story, certainly when we look at the brutality of the Jewish women and children, we can understand that we are under threat in an absolutely unquestioning kind of way. And again, we're pulled to the other reading of Af hein hayu b'oto hanes. We're pulled to the Rashbam's reading that says, no, Af hein hayu b'oto hanes doesn't mean that we were under the same threat. Af hein hayu b'oto hanes means you are the reason why the whole miracle happened. And in this month alone, when I think of Geula, when I think of Jewish heroines, I don't just think of the heroines of past. I think of the Geula, I think of other people. I think of Rachel, the mother of Hirsch Goldberg Polin, who spoke so ferociously and so fearlessly in DC to hundreds of thousands of people. When I think of Af hein hayu b'oto hanes, when I think of Yehudis, this month I think of Oli Megidish's mother, who was Mafresh Chala before her daughter was found, and surrounded by her family in her kitchen, in a moment of, again, unwavering faith, an absolute fearless certainty, she turned to God and she said, Hashem, ani ohevet otcha, I love you. A sentence which went viral, inspired thousands on social media, as well as was mentioned in Knesset and inspired an entire room full of people in Knesset. When I think of Yehudis this month, I think of another Rachel. Yesterday, the mother of Binyamin Erli, another Rachel, who with absolute certainty, bitachon unparalleled, at her son's funeral, spoke about God's plan without any question, with certainty, with an understanding that we hear and we think only that is the strength of the Jewish woman. It's so telling that we see in the Yalkut Shimoni, the Midrash on the story of Rus, and again, Rus echoing the sentiment of Geula, redemption, the line of Mashiach coming from a brave woman who refuses to go anywhere, whose unwavering faith to her mother-in-law, to her faith, is going to be the bedrock on which David and the lineage of Mashiach is going to come. And the Yalkut Shimoni, the Midrash over there says, "Ve'ein hadoros nigalim ela b'schar nashim tzidkanios sheyesh b'dor." We know that in future generations, redemption is not going to come other than at the hand of the righteous women of that generation. Shene'emar, as it says, "Zachar chasdo ve'emunaso lebeis Yisrael." Remember Hashem's faith, where? In Beis Yisrael. We know that B'nai is a reference to the men, and Beis is a reference to the women. It's going to be the women of the Jewish people who are going to be the bedrock of Emunah and the bedrock of Jewish faith. And so I'm once again reminded of the words of Yirmiyahu as I think about these Rachels, and I'm humbled by their faith. And I hear the calling of myself as a Jewish woman, the calling to each and every single Jewish woman of every generation to find that Yehudis, that Jew within us, that absolutely unwavering, fearless, brave Jewish woman who is not willing to move right or left, with absolute certainty that not only will salvation will come at our hands. And I'm reminded of the original Rachel, who also, like the women we're seeing today, Kol B'Rama Nishma, is heard up on high, crying. Rachel mevakal baneha, she is crying for her children, and she refuses to be comforted. And Hashem says, Min I kolech mi bechi, okay, stop crying. Ve'enayich min dim'ah, and your eyes from tears. I recently spoke at a shul, and a woman said to me, she came up to me after I spoke about another brave woman, Sarah Imenu, and she came up to me afterwards and she said, I haven't really prayed before in my life. This was a woman in her 50s and her 60s. She said, I haven't really prayed before in my life. But since the 7th of October, she said, I think God's going to get tired of hearing my voice. He might have to bring salvation just because he wants me to stop praying. And I was reminded also of this line. Hashem says, okay, yesh schar lepulasech, there is a reward, Rachel, for your actions. V'shavu me'eretz oyev. You return from the land of your enemies, a line which takes on so much more meaning today than ever before. V'yesh tikva, there is hope. Lacharitech, for the end of time. V'shavu banim nigvulam, the Jewish people will return to their borders. And so when we step back from our Jewish stories, our Jewish education, the fairy tales that we learn as Jewish children, as Jewish little girls and boys sitting in playgroup on the mat, learning about the heroes, about Hanukkah, and we look back and we say, who are these heroes? And as I said, when we look with intellectual honesty, with spiritual seeking, we find that the message is so much more profound than a fairy tale. The message is, let's transpose the hero, the female hero, the Yehudis hero, generation after generation, midor ledor, in order to understand, in order to be inspired, in order for it to be a call to action for Jewish women to come and bring about the redemption. And I'll end with the line brought by Yehudis in the moment as she's about to kill Heli Fornos, a line which I think we've all been saying for the last month, and we should say it with such a certainty that it is our lived reality. He says to Hashem, Yalla. He says, Karva es pedot am nachalasecha. The time has come for you to save your people. May we experience a Geula in the hands of not just our brave and fearless soldiers, our the forces of good against the forces of evil, but also Beit Yisrael, the Jewish women who are, with their faith, with their tefillahs, with their commitment to bitachon in Hashem, who are going to bring about the Geula. Thank you, everybody, for joining me despite the early hour in the morning, and wishing us all a chag of light and the strength to continue and to be enlightened and to bring light into the world. Happy Hanukkah.